Welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. It's great that so many of you have turned up so early in the morning at 9:15, so congratulations, and I hope it will be a lively and interesting session. My name is James Painter. I work for the Reuters Institute, which is part of Oxford University, and we do a lot of work around climate change and the media. And I was also a journalist at the BBC for too many years, to be honest. But I have moved from journalism to studying journalism. And the context for this session is that we published a book at the end of last year on digital-born or digital media players and how they cover climate change, which is this book. And that's the only promotion I will do, but it forms the context for this session. We're very lucky indeed. We've got two great speakers. So we've got Milene Larsson from Vice, who is a senior producer and a reporter for Vice News. She's won a lot of awards for her documentary filmmaking, but if I listed all of them this morning, it would take at least another 5 minutes. So I'm just going to say she's a very, very established documentary filmmaker, and she's going to be talking about Vice's coverage in general of environment issues, and specifically about how they covered the COP summit in Paris at the end of 2015. And then we've also got Stuart Millar, who is the head of news at BuzzFeed UK, but he's also worked for The Guardian in several roles in the past. I'm afraid the third speaker, who was Akshat from Quartz, is not able to come because for personal reasons he was unable to travel to Perugia, but these two will more than make up for him. So what I propose to do, I'm just going to speak for 2 or 3 minutes about the context of climate change coverage in general in the media. Then we'll talk for, 20 minutes maybe, and then hopefully we'll have lots of questions from you guys too, particularly Milene and Stuart, but also I might chip in myself, both as moderator and panelist. So I hope that sounds interesting and exciting, and we'll kick off. So just by way of context, I think there's a couple of points that are worth making to frame the discussion. I think many of you who are interested in environment and climate change issues will know that they haven't featured strongly in many of the recent electoral campaigns. Even though these are incredibly important issues, you could argue that climate change is the most important existential threat to us on the planet this century. They did not feature strongly in the US presidential elections. I think there was just one mention by Hillary Clinton in all of the 3 presidential debates. In the EU referendum debates, in the media coverage in the UK, environment issues hardly got a mention at all. There's a study by my colleagues at Loughborough University which showed it came bottom of around a list of 10 topical issues in the media coverage. No one was talking about the environment, even though in the UK most of environmental legislation comes from the EU. There was recently a study of the US amount of coverage of climate change on the US major networks in 2016, and there was a grand total of just 50 minutes right across 2016 in the evening bulletins of ABC and other networks, and that was at a historic low. So I think the real issue that would be really fascinating to hear both Milene and Stuart talk about is how do you make this difficult topic of climate change interesting to audiences. There's a lot of academic work showing that for many audiences it's too remote, too alarming, too depressing for people to really engage with. And yet these new, what we call digital-born players like Vice, like BuzzFeed, we could also mention Vox and others, have actually allocated a lot of resources and a lot of thought and a lot of interesting new ways of covering that topic. We chose for this book, which may be of interest to you, 3 of these new or newish players, which were Huffington Post and these 2, Vice and BuzzFeed. And the reason that we did that was we did a lot of survey work in 26 countries, which showed that those 3, Huffington Post, Vice and BuzzFeed, were very popular amongst those audiences who were already interested in environmental news. Huffington Post in the US was the most consulted source by particularly young people, but by all age groups, more than New York Times and others. Vice and BuzzFeed did very well as well, not just in English-speaking countries, but also in France as well. So the key issue is, as I keep saying, what is it that these guys do that's different and interesting that makes climate change and environmental issues important to their audiences? What we did in the book, for those of you who are interested, is we tried to examine how their coverage was different to legacy or mainstream media. And we looked at the volume of coverage, the type of topics they covered, who did they speak to, was the tone of their coverage different, was it witty, irreverent, compared to other types of coverage, and I'm very happy to talk about those results if you're interested, but I thought it would be more interesting to talk more to Milene and Stuart and get their points of view. So I'm going to now talk briefly to Milene and Stuart about their coverage. So Milene, if I could start with you. You went to Paris, the Paris summit, even though you would be the first to say that environment or climate change is not necessarily your main beat or main area. You've got other people at Vice who do that. But for those of you who haven't seen, Vice did a really interesting series of videos, which you call Climate Emergency, I think, a series of 6 dispatches, which were about 6 to 8 minutes long, something like that.
The first one was, I think, 18?
18,
so
my
like
God.
An hour or more in total.
Okay, but if you haven't seen them, do go and see them. And one of the things that was really interesting is that you didn't really spend a lot of time covering the nitty-gritty, the details of those negotiations. You spent a lot more time with people who were demonstrating, who were organizing. Was that deliberate? What was your general approach?
So I was thinking, I might not cover climate change as my primary thing, but it's something that concerns all of us, and especially young people. It's our future. Like, as Obama said, we're the first generation feel it's a fact, and the last generation to be able to do something about it. And I thought about this really crucial meeting, and how do we cover it? How do we speak to our audience, and how do we make it interesting? Because I was actually taught a funny expression by some French colleagues who are here today, called noyer le poisson, like drown the fish with words instead of getting to the point. And for me, these big meetings, although they're really important and a great effort and need to happen, there's a lot of talk that will feel like you drown your attention, like you can't. And how do you, for me, making films, like how do you make an interesting film with lots of people in suits talking in a way that is pretty much designed to make you fall asleep? It's like, I can't, sorry. So I was looking what was happening around that, because I've been covering protests, civil uprisings, and I knew that a lot of people that I've been filming before were going to Paris. And then I found out that people from 80 countries are coming to Paris, victims of climate change from islands all over, from Alaska, and lots of young people. And it was going to be, Paris is going to have the biggest climate march in history. And also, they were going to try to, the Coalition Climat 21, so it was like the coalition of all the different groups, were organizing their own summit. So these were passionate people who came and did what they felt was put pressure on politicians at this crucial time. And that was the passion and the sort of creativity with all the different things that they were doing. They were doing lobby tours, they were doing civil actions, they were doing posters where they were making, you know, almost like using humor to point out how many of the big emitters were actually sponsoring the talks, and how this is a way to buy time and greenwash their continuous use of fossil fuels, when we're actually, like they said, that's why we called it climate emergency, because France at the time was in a state of emergency. There had just been the terror attack at Bataclan, and therefore this was where I really felt like now I need to go. All of these people who had gathered, who had planned for years to come, were suddenly not allowed to protest because of the state of emergency. And for them, the climate was a state of emergency, and I think we can all agree to that. And the biggest climate march in history was about to take place the day before the talks began, and where all of the world leaders were in Paris, people were not allowed to march. So I thought, hey, I have a camera, we have thousands of people who watch our stuff, I'm gonna give them a voice. So yeah.
But one of the interesting phrases that you used there were a lot of passionate people on those demonstrations. And I think one of the ways that your reports stood out was the role of emotion and the role of passion, whereas many of the other reports that the mainstream media may have done were much less passionate or emotional. Do you see that as part of your reporting, to try and capture the emotion and the passion?
Well, I mean, what else will drive change? Like, I don't know. Like, it's just that day, Ban Ki-moon said, now it's more important than ever for civil society to put pressure on your leaders. And how do you do that without passion, without this? So it's about, you know, cutting through all of this bureaucracy and all of these sluggish things, all of these compromises with the people who are polluting, and just get people who are there like, wait a minute, our planet is gonna, you know, not last for more generations, and we are actually really angry about this. And it was the anger that, you know, like we said, climate change is something so distant. It's easy for politicians to play on our sort of, oh, it's distant, I don't know what to do about it. I'm just not going to think about it and continue driving my car and using lots of plastic cups and I don't know, you know, and then you need to make it more of an imminent threat. And so I think people who were there many of them already facing the effects of climate change, many of them really taking this seriously. To them, it is an imminent threat, and I think that was a way of saying that during these talks.
The other crucial, in my view, about your style of reporting that distinguishes you from many other styles of reporting is what you and others have described as immersive journalism. So on not all of them, but on some of these climate emergency dispatches, you were quite clearly taking the viewer on a journey with you. You were there in the demonstrations, as you said, you smelt the smoke, you felt the fear, you were there in a way that perhaps the BBC would not have been there. And I'm wondering how you would describe to this audience, what is that style of reporting that is broadly called immersive journalism?
Well, I mean, I'll give some very easy example. I mean, the idea of immersive journalism is to, in a way, if you're the viewer, what would you experience if you were there as somebody who is sort of catapulted into it? Mm-hmm. And so in a way, the way we use host is almost like an avatar for our audience. That
like an avatar?
Yeah. Well, isn't that what Avatar was? Like you go in and...
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, that is the idea of just going through something, an event, and then meeting people. But we also try to make it very character-driven, find people to give people a voice within this and finding out through this. So we're just like the way of using a red thread throughout. So for example, some of the dispatches were following what was happening during the course of a day, and it was not always the same people. So you go there and show all the different things happening, and yeah.
Okay, I'll come back to you if I
Yeah.
may, but let's just bring Stuart in. BuzzFeed also sent somebody to cover the COP summit. BuzzFeed also do a lot of coverage of climate change and the environment in new and interesting ways. So maybe, Stuart, give us the big picture. Is climate change and the environment a big story, and how are you trying to be different to reach your particular audience?
It's a big story for BuzzFeed. So you understand, we have two science correspondents based in London and then a science team in New York, including a specialist environment reporter. It's a big part of their coverage, and the brief is always, like every BuzzFeed story, is to try and find the framing of the story or the emotional centre of it that will make our audience want to read it, share it, and engage with it actively. And it was interesting hearing Milene talking about how she approached Paris, because that's almost exactly how we approach the climate story as well. It's the sort of dry policy decisions of, negotiations and 2C versus 4C and all that stuff just leaves people cold. Whereas if you find the people who are affected by it, the emotion, the passion, and find a way and take the reader to those events, then they will engage with it. In BuzzFeed, we're always trying to do serious things in a fun way and fun things in a serious way, and that's how we approach all our journalism. And climate is just a sort of another example of that. So we're always trying to find sort of witty or sort of fun frames to do subjects. A good example is we have a data specialist on the science team in the US, and he did this amazing thing during the US election campaign where he, when Trump had said that climate change was, quotes, bullshit, he took sea level rise data and mapped it against all Trump's oceanfront properties and showed that, and then we built GIFs of this visualization of the water taking out Mar-a-Lago and Trump Hollywood and all these US properties, and that was huge because it was sort of, it was cheeky and it was fun, but it was also deadly serious and political as well. And we learned a lot from that stuff, although I should say, for all BuzzFeed's sort of audience magic, it is still really hard. You have to work really hard to get people to engage and care, and quite often even the sort of best climate idea just doesn't fly because people just think it's too big, it's too hard, I'm not going to think about it.
If I could just pick up on a couple of those issues. Do you happen to know which of the stories or treatments or content that you have done have been shared a lot? As we all know, you're completely driven, or mostly driven by shares on social media platforms. Do you know which type of stories or which type of treatments do well?
Actually, I mean, I was looking at the sort of climate change stuff, preparing for this, and there's lots of different types of stories do really well. So since Trump was elected and he's sort of, gone about sort of dismantling the whole sort of infrastructure for tackling climate change, it's become a sort of much more serious political news story. And we've had a couple of big scoops there. And when you break a big story, then people really engage with that, especially when it sort of feeds into that sort of Trump
for example?
wave. Well, we broke a story just after Trump took office. I think it was in that sort of first 2 weeks where he was sort of shutting down science, basically, and we broke the story that they had locked down the US Department of Agriculture scientists from speaking publicly about any findings, and that completely blew up, and within hours the administration had backpedaled, and we got the scoop on them backpedaling as well. But that story was massive for us. But at the same time, the Trump sea level rise one I'm talking about was also huge because that was funny and serious. We also do things like quizzes, which always do really well because it's a sort of fun way of getting the sort of science facts across in a sort of more engaging way, just in, here's another explainer that you could find on Google. So all those different kinds of coverage do really well, but you'd really have to sort of, you have to have a sort of really good idea and execute it well, or find a great story to make people want to read it.
Yes, I remember you did a quiz on, do you know more than the average American?
Yeah.
That's slightly racist, isn't it?
Well, it was American that did it. So, and it was based on, that quiz was based on real data. It was a survey data on the sort of average climate knowledge of Americans, and we built a quiz out of that. So we could have, that's a great example, because we could have done a news story that said, slightly hand-wringing news story that says, feed into all your prejudices about Americans, who I love, obviously. That Americans know very little about climate change, and you could have done it in a really straight way, but we did it as a quiz, and people loved it.
And you did 10 furry animals that are under threat from climate change. Was that popular and successful?
Yeah, those things always do really well. And the other one, the sort of, 11 insane pictures of how people are adapting to climate change. Those are classic BuzzFeed frames for doing fun stuff, where you make it very visual, and you use sort of fun quotes and pictures, and people just want to share those. And those are the things that sort of blow up on Facebook. Or in Paris, we had a reporter in Paris called Jim Dalrymple, who's based in the LA office, and he's a he's not a science reporter, he's a BuzzFeed reporter, and he used all his BuzzFeed sort of frames and tricks to try and make Paris more engaging. So we do, we often, at big events, we do a whiteboard thing where we get people to write a message on a whiteboard and take a picture. So we did a lot of that sort of coverage there, which is very much about taking people behind the scenes, and this is what it's like here, this is what people are really talking about. And all his news stories were written with much more tone, and sort of, not assuming that the reader is across every bit of sort of climate change policy, much more sort of accessible to.
Okay, I'll come back to that, but I just want to bring in Milene. You mentioned Trump, and of course the very different environment now in which environment and climate change stories are being told. And you were telling me before that Vice is actually doing, in some ways, more about the environment now that Trump has come along.
So what's interesting with Vice is that we now have a daily half-an-hour news show on HBO in America, and also a weekly one with longer pieces. And Vice News Tonight, as it's called, has hired one of the best young environmental reporters called Ariel Duhaime-Ross, who is now since Trump was elected, taken on so many climate change stories, especially affecting Americans, and on primetime TV. So what we do is that we use our resources to get stories out about climate change in today's America, as well as all of these pieces then being able to live online and on social media and so on, so that we use all of the different platforms to reach as many audiences as possible.
And is that partly because you think that mainstream media or legacy media in the US aren't doing this story enough, or is it more driven by what your younger audience is interested in?
Well, I guess it's both. Yeah.
Okay. And before I hand over, and I hope you've got lots of questions, is one of the interesting findings of our survey was that both Vice and BuzzFeed, and to a less extent Huffington Post, but you could also say the same of Vox, often the approach is not necessarily what's the story or what's the angle, but how are we going to represent this visually? What works visually. So the amount of photographs and the amount of videos that you guys, not so much video in your case, but certainly your case. In other words, it was a very visual experience, much less text-based than perhaps would have been the tradition with other players. Is that something at BuzzFeed that you're very conscious of?
One of the sort of rules of thumb of getting people to share things, especially on Facebook, is it has to be visual, and lots of text doesn't share well. People just switch off, and also these are really sort of complicated stories. So and if you can tell them in a visual way, it makes them much more understandable. So that's always something we're thinking about, and also more video, because we're sort of hiring lots of video people. We've just got a video news person in London now, and we're thinking about how we sort of tell stories with video too. Can I just pick up on something Milene said as well about, I think on Trump, it does feel like there's a sort of gap there that needs to be filled. And I know the New York Times and others are hiring lots of environment correspondents, but I think it's an interesting thing just now, because of the way Trump is going, that the climate story has almost sort of stopped being a science story and is now hardcore politics. And that's very much the sort of area we're looking at, sort of picking this story up, because it does feel like there's a sort of gap there. And BuzzFeed's always been about finding beats in areas that others are not covering well. So that feels like a good one for us to be.
Just on this point, Milene, there's been a lot of discussion, I don't know whether you and the audience have been part of it, about different types of video and what types of video work well, what types of narration work well. Do you do video without commentary but with text? Is your style still very much the reporter commenting on what's going on and including, or do you experiment with other types of video reporting?
Well, now we have so many different formats, and but for example, the news show, we've started using, because we're suddenly having to make shorter pieces, then we have to use a lot of the information creatively in sort of graphs or visuals on the actual story, so that you can get, while you're seeing a story about somebody affected, for example, like an island outside of Virginia where half the island is already underwater and it's going to be underwater, so you'll have climate refugees in the US. You'll get stats about how much this is affecting years, all of these things that you don't need to say while you're watching the image. So yeah, there are ways of using different ways of storytelling. But I think the main thing still is always the story, and to have it story-led, and to be really smart when you think about what you do, and to make things tangible. And I mean, the climate story is very much, in a way, the David and Goliath narrative. And climate doesn't care. It doesn't have feelings. You can't talk to it. But what you can do, which poses a bit of a difficulty when you. But what you can do is, as you said, you talk to the people who are affected by this, or who are working towards trying to find the people responsible, and then you have the people responsible for the global warming. And this is really interesting. So Ariel did a story, which I really, really found fascinating, about a mountain guide in the Andes, who is the first person to sue a big emitter for potential future damage of climate change. And the reasoning, it was super interesting. The reasoning was, and it was a lawyer in Germany who had taken this upon, she was like, this is really good, this is what we need to do. So the reasoning was, it was a German, I can't remember the name of the greenhouse gas emitter, but who was, I think, PM or something, who was actually responsible of 0.5% of global warming with their emissions. And so their reasoning was, since you're responsible for 0.5% of the global warming, then surely you should then be responsible for 0.5% of the cost of this glacier lake that's going to come and invade our village. So we're going to sue you so that we can protect our village. And that was really interesting because, and obviously the company came back and said, there is no legal obligation for us to do anything like that. And this is the thing. This was the problem with the COP21. It's not legally binding. Where are the accountability mechanisms? And none of the big polluters have any response. They've been paying lots of money to sponsor, they sponsor all of the big climate events, right? And so it's like buying time to, clean coal. What the hell is, anyway, so it's like finding this.
That's interesting, which leads me on to my final round of questions. How do you see the story around climate change? Everybody agrees it's a mega story. There are many dimensions to it. As you said, it's now much more of a politicized story. As you've said, there's a whole series of themes about holding the powerful to account and who is responsible. There's lots of stories around who are the people who are affected. There's one body of thinking, particularly perhaps too much in academia, that says we need many more stories that are solution-based and positive stories about what people are doing. The problem being that, in very crude terms, so much of climate change is doom and gloom. People find it very depressing, even though you can bring alive people who are affected, often then not necessarily your neighbors. So is there any feeling, and it's something that Huffington Post do a lot of, is sort of what you broadly call solution-based journalism. In other words, trying to see climate change as an opportunity to build a better society with less air pollution, with low carbon development, with better health. Is that a sort of part of your thinking, or not really? Stuart, you first, and then Milene.
Yeah, I think you have to think about telling positive stories where there are positive stories to be told, and I think where it becomes problematic is if you're sort of, you're just on the basis of you need to be cheery and optimistic, you sort of build up things that are just not really there in terms of solutions. So, and I think it's a sort of, balanced coverage. I do think, though, that what's far more important and will be more important is accountability, the political dimension of this, because, we can't, I think there was a sort of feeling for a while from people that it's okay, Obama, the grown-ups have got this, they're doing as much as they can, we can sort of get on with their lives. And now Trump has torn that apart, so there's a sort of real job for journalism to do there, to be the sort of opposition on climate change. But I think another thing that we'll see going forward is, I hope, fewer sort of grand sort of campaigning type pieces of journalism that are so huge. I think almost sort of exacerbate the problem of making this feel like a huge and distant issue. And I come from my Guardian background, where we've done quite a lot of those big campaign things, and they're incredibly resource heavy, and some great journalism appears, but nothing much actually happens in terms of changing the real world. So I would like to see much more political coverage of climate change, both in terms of accountability and real-world effects, and make it much more local and less more local. Yeah.
Okay, Milene, without giving too many great ideas for stories away, where do you see you and your colleagues sort of bringing this issue alive even more in the coming months?
Well, I'll take on from what Stuart said. I think, of course, there are countless solutions. That's not the problem. Like solar power, all of these things exist. It's just the lack of the political will and the lack of accountability mechanisms. So I see, for example, I would love to carry on with the climate movement that started, because they've already done global actions on the same day, and continue sort of showing, because I think what we need to do is shed light on the people who are actually trying to do something, because we're in this idea that people don't have power, we don't have any political power, but actually if we all think that, nothing's going to change. And so I think it's about inspiring people to use that political clout and use their own power. And how do you do that? So you show, for me at least, it's about showing how you can organize. I mean, I've covered the migrant crisis a lot, and the people who seem to be most efficient on that are the grassroots organizations who, circumvent all of the sort of sluggish bureaucracy and just actually go straight to and help. And so I think there are ways, I did a film about fracking in the UK, and that was a really good example about a huge movement of people from all different fractions of society, age, whatever background you're from, working class, or all of them could come together around one issue, which was, we don't want fracking. We don't want our water to risk being contaminated. And they actually managed to prevent or delay it, at least, for a very, very long time. And yeah, so I think that's what we should, for me at least, that's what's important, to show people, here's how you can engage, here's how you can get involved, here's what you can do, and maybe they'll think about things from there on for themselves. Yeah.
And do those sort of stories get a lot of hits and shares, or not really?
I mean, it depends on how you make them, right?
Yeah.
And that's the struggle. We need to get better at I mean, I'm the first one to say it.
And the truth is, often they don't, and even the best idea sometimes just falls flat, and it's, and that's you just have to work harder, I think, and have a better idea next time, and think of a more engaging way of telling that story.
Okay, we've got about 20 minutes for questions. Has somebody got the microphone ready? Have you got a mic? Okay, great. So any questions or comments, then in the front here, and then to you.
So I had a question, because when you guys were talking, you said that, for instance, climate change is not a popular subject because it sort of sketches this doom scenario. And as you said, it's not very concrete. But I was wondering, because there's also this big debate still going on that says that climate change might not even be real or that big of a problem, or not caused by humans. And I was wondering if you came across this discussion while being busy with the topic of climate change.
Sorry, the microphone is...
Oh, okay, sorry. So what I was wondering, because there's still this huge lobby and debate if climate change is even real or that big of a problem, or caused by humans. And I was wondering if you came across this discussion while working on the topic of climate change.
Yeah, okay, if I could slightly reframe the question, it's around, the role of skepticism in its various forms, and whether BuzzFeed and Vice feel that you have to give a platform to those people who question the science or the impacts. Is that a fair summary?
Well, maybe not give them a platform, but maybe if you came across people that said, you're busy with the subject, how can you even prove that it's real?
Okay, sorry, what you mean in the course of their reporting?
I'll just say, I went to the Heartland Institute conference, the climate change denier conference. Yeah, I mean, this is a huge problem. It's like 98% of the world scientific community all agree that yes, global warming is man-made. And then you have these people who represent the coal industry and all that going, well, actually, you know, and this is like, but they're the same people, like the same people who used to lobby for tobacco not being that dangerous. It's just like this buying time. It's creating confusion is the main tool. Like, I've covered asbestos, I've covered, you know, every poison that you can imagine, every toxin. You'll always have the lobby going, well, actually, there is not full scientific agreement. So you create confusion, and that's how you, that's how you win, or not win, but buy time. But I mean...
Yeah, I think just if I can add, Milene, again, if you go and see her climate emergency dispatches, she went to the Heartland Institute meeting. For those of you who don't know, it's a very powerful skeptic lobby group in the States. And when I interviewed Milene for the book about why she did that, her great quote was, well, I wanted to understand better the absurdity of the human condition, which I thought was a great way of saying it.
No, but it is interesting because, like, they're now two of Trump's main sponsors actually attend these conferences and are involved with, like, the Mercers, like, are involved with the Heartland Institute, and you have people in government in the US, which is a world superpower, who actually don't believe that climate change is real, and this is really dangerous, of course.
That I think is the really interesting thing, that before, you know, when I was working in the US for The Guardian, we had a big story where we got a lot of Heartland emails and documents. Our environment correspondent, Susie Goldenberg, broke that story. But it was always in the context of these people were sort of slightly below the radar and quite on the fringes of bonkers, and, you know, they were influential, but they were still fairly marginal. Now they're standing behind the president while he signs executive orders, rolling back, you know, environmental protections, and that's both a sort of terrifying thing to watch as a human, but also a sort of huge challenge as a journalist of how you expose those relationships. Another story we've broken recently with Trump is how big companies like Exxon, whose, you know, ex-boss is now the Secretary of State, are lobbying about Russia sanctions because they want to get, you know, to get back into exploring in Russia. And I think that's what I mean about the story becomes more political and accountability to expose those. Just one other thing on skepticism, and I mean, BuzzFeed, just our approach has always been, it's not a debate. You know, the science is settled, and where we have done stuff which is always really popular about skepticism, it's really sort of making fun of it, and, you know, it's to sort of, it's not even debunking, it's more sort of, you know, here are sort of 15 crazy things the climate deniers have said this week. It's that sort of treatment where from the start you don't take it seriously.
I do think, though, if I could just throw something else in and then we'll take more questions. Many of you may not have seen, there's an excellent survey of public attitudes towards climate change in 4 European countries that came out a couple of weeks ago by Cardiff University and several other universities joining together. And I'll just give you one headline finding, which is hugely significant. On the consensus, I think you said it's, you know, 98% of scientists believe it is happening and we are a major factor. Only 35%, that was the highest figure in the 4 countries included, agreed with the statement that more than 80% of climate scientists are in agreement about climate change. So I think it's not just that, you know, there are these outlier people in the United States, to a certain extent in the UK, who are there to question the science and the reasons for it. There's actually a huge sort of public education sort of impetus, or imperative, I should say, to actually understand the overwhelming scientific consensus. And people don't, and that's the harsh reality. And I think there's a role for the media in helping that. But let's take other questions. I think you were next, yeah? And then we'll try and take 2 or 3 more.
Well, it's kind of going on her question, because I listened to a report lately of an old coal miner who was talking about clean coal, and that coal wasn't really that dangerous, but you could hear his breathing. He was in terrible state. It was really painful just to hear him say those things. And then you're not, in that way, you're not talking about the lobbyists and things, but you're talking about the people, the people you want to reach out to, and you want to get out into the streets. And he's probably not the only one. So how are you going to convince those people who are just so dependent on this coal because it's their work, that they are denying their own physical state?
Was this a coal miner in the USA, was it?
Yeah, it was USA,
Okay,
yeah.
so coal miners in the USA, as we well know, Trump has made some very strong statements about supporting coal. So how do you cover that? And indeed, how do you take coal mining communities with you in a way that can move towards low carbon development?
A nice, easy question. Yeah, I'm not sure how many coal miners that we have in the BuzzFeed audience, but I think there's only so much you can do, and I don't think it's the job of journalists to try and persuade every single person that about the rightness of a case. What you have to think about is just continuing to report, finding the story, reporting the facts, breaking stories, finding engaging ways of telling them, and you can't, somebody whose livelihood depends on it, whose physical health has been broken by it, but still believes, you sort of got to think that's a lost cause, really, I would say. But in terms of reporting, I think some of the things we've had success with is where you go to sort of communities that are unexpectedly being hit by the effects of climate change, and you show where the sort of failures of political accountability and the influence of big money has led to their problems. So there was some parts of South Carolina which were hit by hurricanes, which previously didn't used to get hit by hurricanes because the way warming has sort of changed these weather patterns. And we had reporters there, and these, this is South Carolina. These are people who are not naturally sort of, green campaigners, but being able to show that not only were their houses destroyed because climate change is having an impact, but they couldn't get federal emergency money because the government wasn't keeping up to date with the latest, developments and the progress of climate change. Actually was a way of showing them this is something they have to care about and have a voice in.
And coal mining?
Well, no, I think that's quite interesting because we see climate change as maybe not an imminent threat, and what is an imminent threat are lots of people losing their jobs within the fossil fuel industry, and this is something that politicians use, and it's something that maybe in a weird way, in the way our human brains are geared towards their own detriment, is like the way that you can cause something that it's important to act on now. So that's why suddenly you went from Obama trying to actually do something and take responsibility to Trump, who goes, let's end the war on coal. That's crazy, but also you can understand that this is the reality of people across America, and this is an important story to tell, but really it's a political responsibility. You need to create alternative jobs. I mean, if we would actually go over to a green economy, can you imagine how much workforce that would require, how many jobs that could create? So really what people should be demanding are solutions to how do we, if we stop coal mining, what can we do instead, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are many, many ways that journalists could cover that and try to propagate and propel such a move.
If I could just add, my understanding, I'm not an expert on the US, but there are a number of NGOs in the US who've worked very closely with coal communities about what would be a way forward that wasn't dependent on coal. And they're doing some great work in some of them. If I can afterwards put you in contact if you're interested. Let's try and get a couple more, 2 or 3 more questions in. Any others? Yep, at the back then.
Hi. You were saying that a lot of good climate stories don't do very well online. So even if you think, well, this will do well in terms of clicks or shares, but they don't. But I was just wondering, what do the stories that do very well have in common? Is that humor? Is that emotions? Is that, what is it?
I think you said, you pointed out some, but if you could give more examples, that would be great.
I think it's, they don't all have the same elements, but I think for BuzzFeed, whether it's climate change or anything else, the things that do well is where you sort of find the emotional heart of the story and then frame it around that. So, emotion, which Milene talked about, that's a passionate response. Other things are like, wit and, a fun way of presenting it, a visual tricks. So there's the sort of story itself. A great news story will always do well. There's something which has got a sort of real emotional center, and often that will be character-based. So if you find, real people at the middle of a story and then build the story around them, those tend to do better. And then there's just sort of great presentation or wit or humor or fun. So not all the stories have all of those, but they'll always have a bit of each. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'll say the same thing. You need to have a really strong story, a really good story like with characters and passion and all of this. You also, there's something new that you're saying that people didn't know before that is presented in a really good way, that will make it. But it's also sometimes it's circumstantial. Yeah. It's also about like, for example, you're a big media company and you have tons and tons of stuff coming out, and then there's like a whole team just sitting and making sure that everything goes on social media, and if you need to also be able to make sure that they're prepared to push it and so on. So this is like lots of different factors and reasons, but yeah, the thing as a journalist that you can do is, like you said, like find a really good story, tell it in an interesting way, use the time well, and try to say something new.
If I could just abuse my position, just very briefly, is there evidence that your audience, which is essentially millennials and in most cases, actually are more interested in environment stories and climate change stories than others? Just quickly.
I'm not sure about more interested, but they are sort of definitely interested and start from the position of it's real.
Yeah. Okay. I think you were next in the front.
I was late arriving, so maybe you addressed this in your opening remarks, Stuart, but you did reference briefly while I was here something about the Guardian's campaign, Keep It in the Ground, and you seem to poo-poo that in some way. So from afar, it looked like a great piece of advocacy journalism at scale. And your Rusbridger basically said there's no argument about climate change and we have a moral responsibility to report this as it's actually happening. Yeah. So it looked great, but it didn't move the needle, you don't think?
I think I hesitate to sort of, criticize the project. I thought you're absolutely right. It was a magnificent piece of advocacy journalism. There was a big team of really world-class journalists in a room for months, putting together an incredible package of stories that were meant to be both a sort of call to action and sort of, it had solutions in terms of divestment. It was everything. It was and on a massive, massive scale. And I think at the time it was regarded as this sort of, really groundbreaking, no pun intended, piece of work. But you look back now and you think, well, what actually happened? Some companies divested from fossil fuels, but in terms of the, compared to the ambitions that project had, it's not been kept in the ground, is it? As far as I know, the exploration's still going on, and those resources will be exploited. So I think there's a role for those big campaigns, but it feels to me that people have to think about, does that exacerbate the feeling that these are massive issues that can only be solved on a massive scale, and me as an individual can have no real part in that? And I think it's much more interesting to think about local coverage, local accountability, and engaging audiences in a different way.
I mean, if I could just add, there is a lot of discussion within the UK about the effectiveness of that and how you judge success. I think one of the problems for any newspaper or media organisation taking on a campaign or an advocacy role, you have to be very clear about having limited objectives by which you can measure success. And this was a hugely ambitious aim. And so there are some criticisms. It may have been better to reduce its... and the other issue is the Guardian readers are already committed. They're already a natural audience for that type of campaign. The problem, which we haven't discussed about, is how on earth do you take the centre-right and the right with you? How do you take climate change out of the bunker of being a liberal left issue? But maybe that's another time. I think let's just take a couple more questions and then we'll have to wind it up. Any others? Any others?
Hi. It's more like a remark. It's I feel people are talking about a lot about climate change, but maybe not addressing or not mentioning or including within that expression other issues like the loss of biodiversity or I don't know, the erosion of the land, the loss of fertility in the soil. So maybe those are more tangible topics that journalists could address to reach out to communities and citizens, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. Again, there's a lot of debate about this as climate change sort of captured the environmental space. I think the way to see it is climate change is a threat multiplier, so it makes those sort of issues worse. But do you think sort of climate change has captured those and eclipsed those other issues? Milene and then Stuart, just briefly.
I think that's absolutely something that's, I think everyone tries to cover as much as we can, but yeah, that's really something tangible. Like The Guardian did something really interesting with Greenpeace, where they did a collaboration to find out just, you know, because that's an example like the one you're saying, air pollution. We all know about air pollution, and it's, again, something quite untangible, like, okay. But then what they did was make it really tangible by actually mapping out exactly which kindergartens, and it turns out to be something like 2,000 kindergartens that are in insanely high pollution areas, and suddenly that gives you something tangible. You can, as a parent, like, oh my God, my kid, and suddenly you want to do something. Whereas, oh, there's air pollution, okay, what am I, you know, so this is true. I think this is something that we should focus more on and actually use our time and being able to be paid to find out these things. Like, that's something more journalists should take the responsibility to do, and maybe more collaborations like this. I thought that was brilliant because you then give people a tool and the information they need to go and do something. And I think that's definitely something that journalism should be
and
doing
just if
more.
I could add, it does relate very much to what Stuart was saying. A lot of the problems, we haven't talked about it here, is local impacts. But the state of local journalism in many countries now is so under-resourced in such difficult conditions that it tends to be big national media organizations covering big themes, whereas if you could somehow get local media and local media organizations involved in local impacts from air pollution and others, then you would really be onto something. But Stuart, have you...
I was going to give exactly the same example as Milene. Air pollution has become a big story in the UK this year, because people have started realizing that it's a thing that affects them very directly. We did a story in early January, I think about the 7th, 8th of January, about how for all the roads in London where the annual emissions target had already been breached within the first week of January. And again, that got a sort of lot, so we visualized that, and that got a lot of shares, and then that sort of rolled on into this sort of Guardian, the fantastic Guardian Greenpeace operation. And that feels like, in the UK, that air pollution feels like it's actually become a thing that's got real grip now, and it's become a proper political issue because journalists have sort of kept going at it and make it relatable. And I think that's my point about climate change is a sort of huge sort of subject that people find it really hard to get their head around. But my kid can't breathe on their way to school is something that people really get.
Yeah. Okay, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to bring it to an end. But can we thank Milene and Stuart very, very much indeed for a great conversation. Well done.